Now in this video I want to talk a little bit about understanding what it's like to work in a 3D space here inside Photoshop, especially if you are brand new to 3D. You're definitely going to want to watch this because it's a different thought process working with 3D in Photoshop, in that up till CS3, Photoshop has always been a 2D application. Now what do I mean by 2D? That's two dimensions. And what I mean is the X and Y axis. Now you have the X, which is the horizontal axis, left to right, and then you have the Y axis, which is the vertical axis, which is going up and down. And these are the only two axes you can move things inside Photoshop. But now, since CS3 and now we're in CS6, the 3D features have gotten that much more advanced, and we're working in that third dimension, which is the Z axis, which is whether objects are closer to you or further away from you in 3D space. So let's go ahead and create this into a 3D object so you can see what I'm talking about here. I'm going to go under the 3D menu and go ahead and create new 3D extrusion. Actually, no, I'm going to do a mesh. New mesh from layer. I'm going to go over here and do a mesh preset, which is a cube wrap. It's basically going to take that texture and wrap it all the way around a 3D shape. Now, when you convert, no matter what it is you create, whether it's a text layer or a selection, a path, or in this case an image, or an image wrapped around a primitive shape, you're going to see this convert to a 3D shape, and you'll see what this grid is, which is basically called the ground plane that the object sits on. And it is in perspective. So now we know we're in three-dimensional space because of this grid, and the object itself has sides and tops and bottoms and everything like that. So we're looking at a 3D object now. Now, there are a lot of visual cues to help you when you're working in 3D, so you can really kind of keep your bearings and when you're modifying your artwork. Now, again, the grid, the ground plane grid here, is the first indicator that we are in 3D space, and as I move my view around, I can see from the bottom and everything, and really getting a good idea of perspective. And this visual aid is very helpful if you're compositing a 3D object on a photo background and you need to match perspective or something like that. And so that's very helpful there. And we're going to talk more about the ground plane as we go. But I just want to talk about all the different features that are available to you to help you manage the 3D space. So this cube has been created and is now sitting in this three-dimensional space. So we've got the grid, and now we have also these two colored lines in this grid, or on this ground plane. We have this red one, which is representing the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis of our object. And then we have this blue line. Now the blue line indicates the z-axis, where whether an object is further away from us or closer to us, it moves on this x-axis, or the z-axis rather. Now we have no indication for the y-axis because the y is actually the vertical line, and we're just being indicated with the ground plane right now. If I click and select on this object, I've got my move tool selected and I click directly on this shape, a widget is going to pop up, and this is an axis widget, which allows me to modify my object on these different axis points in different ways. It also is a good indicator of what direction my object is moving. If I go and move this object, you'll notice that the widget moves along with it. So it is keeping it in sync, so I know exactly which way is what. So it is the z-axis, and the red one, which indicates the x-axis, and the green arrow here indicates the y-axis. So notice that there are a number of different objects on this widget. We've got the arrow point, and as I hover my mouse over each one of these, they highlight, allowing me to modify certain features. And as you notice, as I highlight over them, my little smart widget here tells me what this is. It means move on y-axis. I can rotate on the z-axis and scale along the y-axis. So all these different features, not only is it a good indicator of the orientation of your object, but it's basically, I like to think of it as a Swiss Army knife for my 3D object. I can use it to move it along the y-axis here up and down, and notice it constrains the movement as I go up and down. I can hover over the x-axis and move it along that axis here, and move my arrow, or highlight the arrow on the blue axis, and that moves it back and forth on the z-axis. So also you'll notice down here in the lower left corner of my screen, if I move in here, there is that same type of widget with the same type of color indicators for each axis. The difference between that one and this one that's directly on the object is that this axis point, or axis widget on the lower left corner, is the axis of your current view, basically the camera view. whereas this large one indicates the orientation of your object. You'll notice if I rotate the object around, you'll notice the ground plane does not move. However, my widget is moving because it is indicating the position of the object and not the view or ground plane as it is indicated. However, if I go in my 3D panel and select current view, and using the same 3D tool I rotate my object, notice what's going on with this smaller widget in the corner. As I move my view, the ground plane and everything's moving with it, so I'm basically moving the camera, and that widget is moving along with it in sync, and I know exactly what orientation my camera is. Each widget is corresponding to the same color. Red is, of course, the x-axis, green is y, and the blue is z. So they correspond both in the camera view and object view. Again, if you click directly on the object, the widget will appear and allow you to modify each one of those various properties via the widget. You can also modify those properties inside of your panels as well. If I go into the object here and I've got the 3D cube wrap here selected in my 3D panel, in the corresponding properties panel, I'm going to go over here and indicate or click on coordinates. And here I can modify the X, Y, and Z axis of the positioning of the object, the angle of the object, and the scale of the objects. These same features are the exact same ones attached to the widget here. I can go over here and select the square in the center and scale my object up and down just by dragging up and down like that. The widget here, again, rotates the object. When you get the ring, one just below it, scales it on that axis. You can squash it down or stretch it out. And you'll notice as I'm doing this with the widget, notice what property changes here inside of the properties panel. So every time I make a change, it changes in there. I could also use the scrubby slider and just move this over and change that property as well. So you have those properties available inside of the panel as well as on the widget right here, so you can see what direction you're working in. Now, when we're working in 3D, we of course have another set of tools available to us. When we're working in regular 2D objects or 2D layers in Photoshop, we always have the Move tool selected over here to move our objects around or move layers around. And we can, of course, use all these other tools as well inside Photoshop. But to move around a 3D object requires a different set of tools. And that 3D set of tools is right up here in the options bar. Now, they are only visible when you have the Move tool selected. You have to have your layer, your 3D layer selected itself, and you also need to have the Move tool selected. And there are your various sets of 3D tools. You can rotate the object, or this is the free rotation tool, so it just allows you to basically rotate it in all directions. The next one is the Rotate tool. It basically rotates it on the center axis there. This will move it around on up and down, basically in the scene, and then this one will move it on the Z-axis, basically back and forth. So whether it's the camera or the object, or even the lights, this is your unified set of tools right here. So notice if I go in the 3D panel, and let's just say I wanted to rotate the object around, well then I would select Cube Wrap, which is the same as clicking directly on the object. There's always going to be at least 2 to 3 different ways of going about this. No one way is better than the other. It really is a matter of how you like to work. So if I select Cube Wrap here in the 3D panel, then I just grab the corresponding tools allow me to rotate that specific object. And previously in CS5, you would have to choose from a different set of tools each time you wanted to modify something. There was a different set for the mesh tool. There was a different set for lights. There was a different set for the objects. Really made it confusing. Now all you do is select the property you want to modify. If I want to change my camera angle, I'm still using this same set of tools, but now I'm modifying the position that I'm looking at the object and not the object itself. Still with the same set of tools selected, I'm going to select Cube Wrap, and it will allow me to maneuver the object itself around. So numerous different ways to move around an object, reposition it, scale it, modify it. You can do all that both through the panel and through the use of this unified set of 3D tools. Now, a couple of other extra things when working with 3D. You'll notice if I go over here and choose my light, I get a widget that tells me the direction of my light right here. If I select it in the 3D panel, I can actually go in here and move this around and change the direction of the light. Now, we'll get into lights a little bit more detail later, but you'll see that there's a widget here that it demonstrates the direction of the light, the little ball in the center there, and you see this, the end of this stick basically is the light source itself, so you can change the light and get a good visual reference of where that light is positioned. Also, if the light goes off camera, you get a small widget like you see up here that indicates that there is something up there and it is off view. It's outside the visible area of your image. So there's all these widgets that really just remind you that you have elements in place because, again, we're talking about three-dimensional space. There can be things behind you in your current view. There could be things further back, even objects hiding behind other objects. It can happen, and this is something you must think about when you're working in 3D like this. Now, another quick extra, if you go into the View menu, you can actually go down here to the Show and actually show different types of things like the ground plane, which of course by default is turned on. But if you did not want the ground plane, you could just uncheck it by turning it off. The ground plane is still there. You'll notice it's still receiving the shadow here. It's just not visible in case you wanted to modify it without having it in the way or anything like that. Another thing is the secondary view. This actually gives you an up view of your object. You can actually change what position you're looking at it from. You can look at it from the right, the top, the bottom, however you want to see it. And this just gives you an alternate view of your object. When you're editing it in a scene, you can actually get better placement by getting multiple views of it from multiple angles to help you better edit the 3D object. So, as I was saying, it's a different mode of thinking, a different thought process involved when working with 3D. It's just kind of trying to get into that frame of mind as you're practicing and realizing that things that moved around in 2D are going to be a little bit different in 3D, and that's one of the biggest transitional hurdles, I guess you could say, that people have when they're trying to get into 3D, is they get a little frustrated with things because they're having to go into that third dimension, and it can be pretty daunting at times. But just stick with it and understand the workflow is a lot better here in CS6, and we're going to take a look at a lot more of this process in depth as we progress in this course. Now, in the next video, we're going to take a look at a little bit more in depth these 3D and properties panels right here that we have grouped, and show you how the workflow can be really easy when you're managing all your 3D projects through these two panels.